file that we will be using. All right. So we're going to get started in 3, 2, 1. So welcome, everybody. Can't be more excited to introduce today's guest on the Physician Philosopher podcast. So it's Dr. Boyce Fish, and Boyce is someone that I share a ton of stuff in common with in terms of our interests. So I think this show is going to be really, right up your alley as a listener on this podcast in terms of things that we're going to touch on: life, money a little bit, mindset, definitely. And so couldn't be more excited to dive into this. So Boyce is trained originally in emergency medicine, but currently practicing virtual medicine. Also runs a business called Life Coach Physician, where he helps physicians suffering from moral injury and burnout. You might recognize that is something that we are definitely interested in on this podcast. And I'm a big fan of, rising tide, raising all boats. So excited to have Boyce, dive into that niche and help doctors because there couldn't really be enough help out there. So you can find out more about his business by visiting thelifecoachphysician.com. Don't forget the. I did the same thing on The Physician Philosopher when I created it. So I was giving Boyce a hard time about that before the show kicked off. Super excited to have Boyce on. We're going to talk about all of the things, disability. We're going to talk about mental health struggles, mindset work, a recent accident, and so much more. But Boyce, couldn't be more excited to have you on the show. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Jimmy.
So Boyce, let's just kick this off and tell us a little bit about your background, where you came from, what your training is, what your story is. I'd love to know a little bit more about you so that the listeners can get to know you a little bit.
Sure. I got started with a late start to medical school. I actually enrolled at age 33. So yeah, not traditional. I already had 4 kids, went through school with 4 kids, went through residency with 4 kids. By the time I finished residency, my first one was actually in college.
Wow.
So, yeah. So
good for you.
Yeah. The road less traveled, man. I trained medically at Western University of Health Sciences in Southern California. I did my emergency medicine training in Dayton, Ohio. I went on to be assistant program director of emergency medicine there, as well as a clinical instructor for the Wright State program, the Boonshoff School of Medicine program for emergency medicine. So loved teaching, loved my work, still love it. Like there's nothing, I really like helping people. That's who I am.
Yeah, I love it. So you got some academic roots.
Yeah, for sure.
Someone was asking me the other day, I was out to dinner with a friend of mine last night, actually. He was asking me what my big passions were. And I told him, I said, I honestly, if I had to nail it down to 2 things, it's going to be teaching and creating content, just being a creative person, whether that's, creating solutions to problems or podcasts or books. But yeah, I have academic roots and a heart for teaching too. So that's pretty cool. So you recently had a huge accident, and I remember seeing the x-ray of this thing. I guess you told me it was with a triathlon, and your leg was just like completely shattered. So tell us a little bit about that accident, how that happened. And then we're going to touch on a couple of things that you learned from that experience. But I hear it's a good story. So what's the, share it. What's going on there?
All right. So my wife and I trained for Ironman triathlon, and everything got pushed forward because all my races got moved because everybody's like, yeah, you can't race on that. We were in a C race, just a local Olympic triathlon across the state. And I was doing really good. I thought, only one guy with my age group had gone by me, and I came out of the water first in my entire wave. I was a swimmer in college, right? So that shit happened. I got out on the bike, and one guy had kind of gone by me, and I was like, well, maybe I'll see him on the run, maybe not. But in the meantime, I'm in second place, and I come up on this pair of riders, and they're just kind of gapped from each other. And you're not supposed to ride side by side, and you're not supposed to draft. They had been doing both. But they were just sitting there chatting with each other in arrow position. And I was coming up on them, like doing like 26 miles an hour. And I was like, hey, on your left. Because the guy was just parked. You're supposed to ride right and pass left.
Yep.
And at that point, he didn't do anything after 3 cat calls. And I was like, heck with that, put down my power again. I was doing about 26 miles an hour. And then he fully looked over his shoulder. And in the process of doing that, of course, looked into me, which is where your bike goes. And we landed all at once on my hip. And you're right, that hip extended down the femur. They don't have a name for the fracture. Intertroch, peritroch with femoral neck extension and femoral shaft extension. It's a made up word, but
yeah.
Then I had to have that kind of wired back into place to accept all the hardware. I was not allowed to put weight on it for 8 weeks.
Man,
I go from running 35 miles a week and riding, 150 to 200 and swimming to I can't do anything for 8 weeks. Got a blood clot. The blood clot induced from the inflammation induced gout. So I had gout continuously for like 2.5 months. It was an amazing process. But I immediately from the point of the accident, I looked down at my leg. I knew it was broke. And I looked down and I was like, my femur is 2 inches shorter because I was laying on my side and my femur is 2 inches shorter. I was like, I broke my hip, tried to move it, just fasciculations. I'm like, yeah, it's dead. So long road to recovery, but I'm coming back.
Yeah. I didn't expect to talk about this piece of it, but that 8-week gap, what was that transition like going from someone? Cause so I'm not wired this way. I exercise because I need to. It's not something that I just love doing unless I'm playing a sport. But my wife, Kristen, it's like part of her identity. Like, I don't know who my wife would be if she couldn't exercise most days of the week. It's just like something that she does, it's like brushing her teeth almost. So like, it sounds like you were very involved all the way up through that. And then all of a sudden 8 weeks of nothing. How'd that go?
So believe it or not, I'm a little bit more wired like you. I used to chase balls around and stuff like that. And then hashtag she made me do it. She says, you're a college swimmer, so you should do triathlon. Turns out that swimmers are the worst conversion athletes to go to triathlon because it's the shortest, least weighted event. But it had been since 2019 when we did our first half Ironman. It has been a big part of my life, and slowing down like that. There's a lot of mind work that goes into that.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And I immediately started from the moment that I wrecked, I said, well, there's my next challenge. It's what I got to do. My wife will even tell you through all those things going on, I had 1 or 2 down days where I felt like a little bit mopey, a little bit sorry for myself, those kind of things. The rest of it was, this is what's next. Hey, guess what? I didn't like my run form before because I'm a converted runner. I didn't learn to run until I was 48 years old. So I have terrible form. I'm like, well, since I have to learn to walk again, I guess I get to learn to run again. And now maybe I'll have better form.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's, you mentioned like it kind of becomes a part of who you are, whether you want it to or not. And making it over that momentum of just kind of getting started. And then once you do it and you're consistently doing it, it is, something that's like, even for me, someone that would tell you, I played college soccer my entire life. I was a goalkeeper though. I was a goalkeeper for a reason. I did not like a ton of running. So running was always discipline for me. And so then I went to medical school and didn't have a coach forcing me to run for the first time in my life. And I just stopped. I just gained weight, like just didn't work out. And but then once I started doing it, it really did. It's kind of an expectation now that I'm going to work out 3 or 5 times a week. And so that would be a really big shift. But you kind of mentioned that mindset piece, and boys, I want to talk about that in a second. But you also, right before we jumped on this, coming from personal finance background, this really interests me because this lived, life experience that you have that I think a lot of people don't think through, right? So a lot of listeners know about my disability insurance debacle and how I got denied as a 4th-year medical student because I didn't know anything about disability insurance. And I should have waited for guaranteed standard issue policy. And so I teach people all the time about getting own occupation specialty specific disability insurance because it's one of the most important financial tasks that you're going to have. And one of the ways that I teach people is through my mistake. And you just shared with me before hopping on here something that you learned about disability insurance and when you went through this kind of experience. And so tell us about that and what you learned and what people can learn from your experience with that as well.
Yeah. So the own occupation policy has been enforced since 2017 for other reasons. But what I learned was this, and I was a little blown away. So we'd had some troubles with the IRS and stuff like that in the past. That's a whole nother story. They dropped me for an extra $250,000, completely took away my solo 401k because it hadn't been done correctly. All those things. That's another topic. But what I learned on the ONOC policy was they based it on, so I was an S Corp. I'd been making probably a little over $500,000 a year for the past few years before the policy went into play. And what ended up happening was they said, no, you were only making, I think they said something like 200 after taxes. And then I started looking at the numbers, and what they'd done is they'd taken it off of my salary that I'd paid myself from the S Corp and did not include any dividends, which is where the rest of the money was coming through. And so by doing that, my ability to earn money on top of the disability policy is limited to a much smaller number based on their original valuation of what I was actually making, or what they thought I was making versus what I was actually making.
Yeah. And I think that's really important to pick up what you're putting down, because I'll give you an example. I think that it is not uncommon in the coaching space for people to tell you, hey, once you pass a certain amount of revenue in your business, you should switch to an S Corp because you can pay yourself partly through wages and partly through distributions, and those are taxed differently. So you can kind of save money on taxes. But if you're a high income earning physician and you get disabled, they're not going to include any of the distributions in that calculation. So, and a going quote unquote rule of thumb is, and of course, please refer to your accountant, but a going rule of thumb is that you should pay yourself half of, at least 50% or a quote unquote fair wage in your business for your salary for whatever you're doing. And so if you make 500, paying yourself 250, that's kind of in the ballpark of what is typically a rule of thumb. And that sounds great because the 250 that you take in distributions is going to be taxed differently until you get disabled. And they're like, nope, the only part of that $500,000 that you took home that counts is the wages. And so, that's definitely something that I hadn't really heard somebody talk about before, but it makes a lot of sense. And so if you're thinking about building a real estate empire or a coaching business, or you're thinking about, making money, and you have an S Corp as opposed to an LLC, which flows through, all of it flows through in an LLC. That's a big deal. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
And so, but you guys ended up making it work. So, live and learn there, but hopefully other people listening to this will also think about, oh, I probably need to think about my tax situation and how that would impact me if I got disabled. And so speaking about the disability, you kind of said that the disability policy had been in force, for some time now, alluding to something that you're actually really well known for, although people may not know it by your name, because you originally wrote a post, or were part of writing a post that has been shared and become viral. To some extent, it's been shared like over 25,000 times on the one post that I saw, and probably much, much more if you include all of the variations of it. But you went through a really tough spot in 2017 or thereabouts. And so if you're comfortable, I'd love for you to share your story. I don't even want to say what it's about because I think it's so powerful. I'd love to hear it from you. And I'd love to hear why you decided to open up about that and share it publicly.
Yeah. So starting from the beginning, I moved out to Idaho to have my wife be close to her family. I could work with my brother-in-law. The three of us could sit around and chat. We're all the same. We'd rather chase balls, all the things, love teaching, all the things. So I wanted to work next to him. And so finally got into his private group and was kind of on a partner track for them. And in the process of moving there, a major corporation, a major physician management group said, well, you haven't completed your 2 years for us, so you owe us the entirety of your sign-on bonus back. Even though I had worked more than 2 years worth of hours for them, they didn't want to count that. So instead they said, well, if you can work the remainder of your shifts worth of volume by August, with me leaving in May, I ended up working literally 6 and 7, 12s a week for a month and a half so that I didn't have to pay them money back. And for the first time, Jimmy, that's the first sign of burnout. I was like, I didn't want to go to work.
Yeah.
And after I'd been off work for a month and I sort of go back here, it took me a minute to get back in the flow, because for the first time I did not enjoy medicine. That is not what you're supposed to do. And people do that all the time for different reasons, for financial handcuffs and stuff like that. So I move out here and I'm in this hyper-vigilant space where everything's being critiqued, and the road to partner is a year long plus some other stuff afterwards. But essentially they're really watching what you're doing. Had a couple of things when I talk about this, I talk to it as a series of unfortunate events. So the first thing that happens is instead of doing a training shift, this partner there's checking his email. Was like, why don't you just run the floor? It's nice and slow. Well, I didn't know the EMR. I didn't know the system, stuff like that. And on that very first day, he's stroke alert. And then he's like, yeah, you got to take this. I'm like, man, you guys haven't even told me what you do for stroke alerts. The next thing I know, there's a nurse handing me a phone with a neurologist on it. Not only do I not know anything about the patient, and the neurologist wants to talk about him, but I've never been handed a phone before I've seen the patient before. So there was this difficult interaction with a nurse that kind of went over wrong. That came up in my 1 month review, which was 3 months later. And they're like, oh, well, yeah, you had this thing, but it got fixed. Well, then about August, I had a case come in, and despite doing everything by the books and discharging her, she ended up bouncing back with a different diagnosis. And even though I had done everything right, including listing that differential and that she should come back, they rated me as I hadn't performed correctly. And this is where it starts talking about moral injury. Like, I had done everything right. And in the case review, since she had done this bounce back, they did this case review. And when I looked at the case review and I submitted them literature, I did exactly, like, nothing would change if you do it by this literature. And they still said, yep, you're being rated for it. And I'm like, oh, well, that's not amazing. And then there's this cardiac alert that they call it a MIDAS, where they pull the whole team together. Well, they were yelling at me because I didn't call the cardiologist, but I didn't have the patient yet. And then when I did have the patient, the clerk is supposed to call. So there's this huge meeting, like everybody from the hospital administration, everybody's there, and everybody's looking at me until the gal sits up and goes, I was the one that didn't page the cardiologist. Why are you all yelling at him? So this unit clerk kind of bailed me out. But then again, these are stacking up, right? And you're starting to have these thoughts like, man, 2 months into it, before any of this stuff had occurred, they'd already fired one guy. So it's three of us hired at once, and they had already cut one of them loose. You move on, dude. We're done. And then we ended up with, I had another case at that point going to review, and a well-meaning partner, a member of the board, actually pulled me aside and had my wife and I out to dinner with him. And kind of in typical fashion for him, opens up the conversation. He goes, well, you've had 2 case reviews, and the first one didn't go your way, and this one is unlikely. And I agree that it wasn't going to go my way. He goes, if you have one more, they're going to terminate your contract. And so now this is now November, and I'm starting to feel like this increasing weight of pressure, like everything's building up. And at the time I didn't realize it or that, but I did tell my wife, I feel like I'm walking on eggshells.
Yeah.
I don't enjoy going to work where I just feel like the next foot that falls is the one that kicks me out the door, basically.
Sure.
We'd moved all the way across the country. This was my buy-in. Well, then, the series of unfortunate events, I keep having this attention drawn to me. I keep thinking that I've done everything right, but haven't. And in January, we were celebrating our 25th anniversary. And we were, I was still kind of a little bit edgy, but, working my way through it, dotting all my I's, crossing all my T's, and getting things done. And this gal comes in with a flu. It's a 19-year-old girl with a flu. And she had gone to an urgent care 3 days before and received x-rays and stuff like that, tested positive for influenza, was given Tamiflu and discharged. She went back to that urgent care, got another x-ray. And at this point, the urgent care doing something more, gave her azithromycin and prednisone, neither of which are going to help at that point. And then the one that was kind of that got to me, she went to another emergency room, a competing emergency room. And in that emergency room, she had received CAT scans with contrast and lab work and everything else. And she told me, she goes, they did all these things. And so instead of doing this premium workup just 2 hours after she left the other ER, I went and pulled all their notes and had everything shipped over and documented all of the results in my chart, made her feel a little bit better, gave her some racemic lidocaine, actually, because she was complaining of a sore throat.
Yeah.
And she felt better. And I told her, I was like, look, if you need to come back, you can, I've documented this in the computer, how to order it. They can now order it for you if you need this again. But this is the flu. This is the same diagnosis that you had 3 days ago. Yeah. So then we had just celebrated our anniversary, having a great time. I actually went, the next day was our anniversary. That was January the 4th. I ended up working that day, but on the 6th, I went skiing with my daughter and my wife again, having a good time. I came home from that, and my brother-in-law was like, "Hey, you remember that 19-year-old with a flu?" Yeah. And first he's really gentle about it. He comes over, he says, "You want to, let me come over." And he's like, "Yeah, you remember that case?" He's like, "She came back in full arrest this morning." And it was crushing. Like, I've lost patients before, Jimmy. I think it's a combination of kind of everything. I felt really bad for her parents. Like,
Sure.
I made too much personalization out of it. And I felt bad for her, but I kept looking at her parents. I had a 19-year-old who's, now graduating he's getting his master's in electrical engineering, super bright, super amazing. And I kept thinking of all the things that they were going to miss from their daughter.
Yeah.
And it just sent me into a tailspin. So I went from kind of walking on eggshells, moral injury and stuff like that. And all of a sudden I'm just in a dark place. I guess there was one other unfortunate event, like in October, back in October, I had seen a patient, and she had been seen by 3 previous physicians who kept giving her increasingly strong narcotics for back pain, and diagnosed her with disc problem, with sciatica, with whatever, but nobody had done a workup. And so I was just like, this is what we call in emergency medicine a bounce back. So I'm going to do everything. And the first thing that came back was like a calcium of like 19.5 or something like that. I was like, yeah, that's cancer unless something else. So she got the whole thing. Within an hour and a half, she had a CAT scan showing and ultrasound showing mets everywhere, all the way up to her lungs. So hypothesized to be ovarian. And I literally kind of held her hand as I told her about the diagnosis and said, if it's okay with you, I'd like to ship you to the other campus, the other main campus here, because they have the cancer treatment there. Is there any other questions you have, and this and that? And I think her partner, part of it, maybe she didn't like me holding her hand, or I think part of it was just lost, but they filed, since they were both employees of the same hospital network, she filed after her partner died 2 weeks later from untreatable cancer, basically. She wrote a letter to the entire hospital, including the CEO, kind of listing me as a terrible doctor, insensitive, all the things. And of course, that's not how it felt. I felt like I'd done everything right. Again, moral injury. So January the 8th, January 7th and 8th, or 8th and 9th, I was back in the hospital on some late swings. And I just felt so bad for the family. I went up and saw him in the ICU. She was still on life support and still not responding. And talked to the family. The husband was fairly reasonable. The wife was moderately reasonable. She had been there with her daughter, and her grandparents were livid, absolutely livid. In fact, to leave the peace of the ICU, I took them in another room while they verbally berated me. And I just took it. What are you supposed to say? I'm just sorry for your loss. I didn't do anything wrong. Like, everything was documented. There was no more workup to do for this young gal. It's influenza, and some people don't respond well.
Yeah.
So yeah, then on the 10th, I have my long-awaited 3-month review, which is now past 6 months. And in the process of that review, 2 things are said. They're like, "How are you doing?" I was like, and I'm dark. Like, you can see I'm down. There's no question. Like, everybody saw it. I should not have gone back to work. Everybody saw I was depressed. Everybody was concerned about me. "Are you doing okay?" I'm like, "Well, we all fight our way through this. Is just what I'm gonna do. I'll find my way through it." And so that's what I told him. I was like, we all lose patience. I'll just find my way through this, just like we always do, kind of a thing. They're like, yeah. And so the one person there, 2 of them kind of in the upper echelons of the board / managing the group. And the one says, "Well, this will be your second patient complaint. And in light of, these 2 case reviews and 2 patient complaints, when the board meets next week, they're likely to terminate your contract." On the other one, to their credit, said, "That's not necessarily how it's going to go." Tried to bail me out, realizing, I think, a little bit more sensitivity, how this is going to hit me.
Right.
And, but that's not what I heard.
Had this meeting coming up and you're expecting them to let you go.
Yeah. And I'm just like, I gave them everything. I volunteered when they rolled out a new EMR, because I had rolled it out to 2 other facilities, to be hands on deck. And I'd given them 3 consecutive shifts, and I think an additional one beyond that, of my time for free to help other physicians learn the program. And yeah, I'm going to lose my job. And I came home and talked to my wife about it, and we both talked about, it's fine. You can, the place back in Ohio will continue to fly you out there for as long as we need to do that. You can make plenty of money. It's all good. And so there was always a backup plan and all the things, but that's not what I felt. The very next day, on January 11th, I don't remember much. I wasn't sleeping good because I was in between nights and days. And also just, I was now full out depressed. Like, I think I recognized it then. I think everybody else recognized it. I had a few charts left from the shift on the 9th that I'd worked almost an overnight. So I was going to work on those. I had a book to read. I had soccer queued up on the TV to watch. I don't remember doing any of that, Jimmy. My wife left at about 10 o'clock in the morning, and she left with her sister to go shopping for some furniture for my niece who was in college here. And I don't remember doing anything. I just remember this dark, huge, enormous pressure just crushing down on me. And there appeared to be no way out. And then there was. And it kind of went down like this, kind of like, I'm done. I'm done hurting my family, dragging them around the country, dragging them all the way through medical school. Can you imagine how hard that is on kids, and all the things that I kept taking ownership and blame for? Thinking about the one that I lost instead of the hundreds that I'd saved, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And just everything piled up, and suddenly I snapped, and I knew I was going to take my life. My wife called and said, "Hey, can you pick up our daughter? These things have run late." I said, "Nope, you can." I grabbed what I needed and I headed for the hills. I turned off my phone for auto locating, kind of typed out kind of a note to her. Essentially, I'm tired of this. I thought I could do this. I thought I could be strong, but I can't. To lose the patient was enough, but then to be told I was being fired for it is more than I can handle. I'm sorry. I don't want to hurt you this way, but after one last hurt, I'm gone. And then I texted it to her, and then I turned off my location again. And then I was like, well, I need to write something to my kids. So I wrote a little bit longer thing to my kids, love them, basically bye. Texted that again, turn off location, did what I needed to do. And then like I'm up in the mountains outside of the town, and then the city police officer kind of comes up, and he's just kind of sitting there, maybe 100 yards away, just kind of obviously looking at me.
Yeah.
I'm like, this is awkward. I was supposed to just, be here up by myself. So it's Snowmageddon, and I drive past him and he doesn't do anything. I'm like, okay, cool. And then another sheriff's officer suddenly, because I'm in their territory, comes peeling up, and because of snow, he can completely block the road with his vehicle, except for I have a bigger vehicle, and I stick it in 4 low, and I take it through a snow drift that's probably 8 feet high and several feet deep, and then go on my merry way. I'm not speeding or anything. I just don't want to talk to anybody. So they're following me around. Now I've got I feel like the attendant with a bunch of little ducklings following me, right? And I've got, I think there's 7 cars behind me, sheriffs and police officers in total. And I finally pull over and I lean out the window. I'm like, what do you want? Like, we want to talk to you. I'm like, I don't want to talk, or I would have talked to you earlier. He's like, well, we want to talk to you. Do you have guns in your car? I said, of course I do. You want them? Will you leave me alone if I give you my guns? No, we want to talk to you. I'm like, fine. I don't want to talk to you. I rolled up my window and I left. A bad move. Well, that was a bad move.
Maybe in retrospect, not a bad move.
Well, so what happened next is, we get several blocks further down the road, and they decide to put one of them in front of me and one of them crashes in behind me. And so now I'm completely boxed. Next thing I know is, instead of all their guns pointing at me before, which by the way, it was 2 AR-15s and 3 9mm pointed at me the first time I pulled over.
Yeah.
Now they're coming at me, gun at my head. Get out of your car. Get out of your car. And I'm like, or put your hands up. I put my hands up. They're like, get out. I'm like, so they open the door and I'm like, seatbelt. And so they reach across me to get my seatbelt. And to get the seatbelt, the gun is like right at my head. I'm like, do not squeeze that. That's not what I wanted. And they throw me out. I get tased and I'm just sitting there like, hey, are you suicidal? Yeah. Do you want to die? Yeah. Whatever. And then they gave me my on-site medical care, which is an ambulance came up and took my blood pressure through a winter coat, and said, they also asked if I was suicidal. I said, yeah. And then they proceeded to take me off to jail.
Yeah.
And well, I'd already done what I needed to do. They put me in jail. They supposedly on a watch. But if it hadn't been for people calling repeatedly to say, look at him, he's a doctor, he knows what to do. Somebody came in and looked at me at about 3 a.m, just about right after my sister-in-law had called yet again.
Because at this point, they didn't know that you'd taken anything, right? They didn't know you'd taken some pills.
No.
So they didn't know any of that. They just knew that you were driving on a mountain and didn't want to talk to them. But at this point, you'd already done what you did.
Yeah. They knew I was suicidal. Yeah. And so they just stuck me in the cell and yeah. They came in and checked on me. They said I was taking my last breath. But if you've been around somebody dying before, you know what agonal respirations are, and they may extend past heart rate, which I'm pretty sure was what had happened there. I got 15 minutes of CPR, brought to the local a different emergency department, the one that I'd wanted to go to begin with, which, if they'd tested me, I would have figured out what I'd done, or at least I'd been under medical supervision on a monitor when something would have happened. But my labs were insane. I don't have like the numbers in front of me, but my lactate was like 15.8. My BUN and creatinine were off the charts. They were like, I think my BUN was 3.8 and then creatinine was like 40. I mean, my reverse that creatinine and BUN.
Yeah.
And I was really sick and I was not responsive. I had like cerebrate, decerebrate on each side of my body, unresponsive to pain or other stimuli. They intubated me, stuck me in the unit. I was still in jail. My wife tries to come see me, but she can't see me because I'm cuffed to the bed and I'm considered in jail. The next few days, I have almost no memory of. I was done, man. I was cooked. And I guess I started turning a corner a day and a half later, about 2 days in. They figured out what was going on. They started reversing that. They also had the courage to, somebody pushed TPA on me after. They're like, hey, he's got all this right heart strain. Maybe it's just a massive PE, which probably was if I'd been laying there for long enough. And they pushed TPA on me, which after somebody receives chest compressions, that's probably
not a good idea.
That takes courage.
Yeah.
But probably saved my life, right?
Yeah.
And 4 days, they took me off the vent on day 4 and then transferred me up the medical floor. I spent total 7 days, almost 8 days in the hospital there, and then went to an inpatient psychiatric facility for another 3 days. I checked myself in because I knew the routine. And then when I figured out, and this is where it starts coming back to me, like, what have you done? My wife is coming to visit me and I can see how hurt she is. But I can tell you, when I woke and found loving family, non-judgmentally around me, like everybody had flown in from all over the country. My parents, some of my siblings, my kids had flown out from Ohio where they were living, my adult boys. And just having that loving support was helpful.
Yeah.
That was amazing. But then in the facility, as I'm participating in group stuff and doing my writing stuff, I realized, oh my gosh, I have completely hurt my family. And I just wanted to leave. And she's like, well, you can't leave. I said, well, guess what? I checked myself in and I know the rules. I can now check myself out.
Yeah.
I mean, technically the psychiatrist could have put me on a hold, but
yeah,
from that day forward, I have done everything I can to redeem myself for my family. And they say it's enough and I don't have to apologize anymore, but tell you what, every January 11th, there's a group of texts that go out. I'm sorry for how this changed things. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, it's, man, first of all, thank you for sharing that. I know that, it has been my experience, and I'm sure it has been your experience, that being transparent with mental health difficulties and struggles is profoundly impactful for other people who are scared to share what they're going through. And so thank you for being willing to do that. And, for me, like when I listen to your story and I listen to the front end of it about the series of unfortunate events, and the moral injury and, the variety of things from, the girl and the ED from the influenza case, or the other case series you're getting rated and reviewed by the hospital. On the backside of it, it's almost the opposite story, where it's a series of fortunate events where you ended up running into cops, both like philosophically, figuratively, and literally, right? And then they didn't pull the trigger, right? And then somehow you ended up in jail, and somehow somebody saw what happened, and then somehow somebody did enough to save you and get you to an emergency room. And then, somehow the emergency room was able to do what they did, transfer you to the ICU. Like it's almost this mirror image of these series of unfortunate events that led to this penultimate moment that was followed by these series of fortunate events that allows you to be here and share this story.
Yeah. So I, when I shared this, I shared it initially anonymously. You can find it on Kevin MD, among other places. But it went nuts. And my wife still doesn't understand how to get to that point. She herself has depression, right? But she doesn't understand how you get to that point. She doesn't understand it. But when she read the comments coming off of like Doximity and Sermo, and some of them off of Kevin MD, and some, where other healthcare professionals are like, I totally get it. Thank you for sharing your story, this and that. And we've met people like personally, thank you for sharing your story. For the first time, my family understands where I'm at as, a resident on my second attempt. They kind of understand some of the pressures and things that you go through as a physician. And that has made it easier for me to talk about. There's a fair amount of shame, Jimmy. I mean, this is the weakest link, right? This is the thing that we all fear becoming. We're all trained to be Superman. And that's not true. We're not. Like that's a fallacy right there. But it's hard to talk about. Like when I've lectured on this, I've done some lectures, and I'm due for another one here in April. And when I talk about it, it's like, I think I would rather stand up here naked, and I'm a shy person, than talk about this. But then the response, like I spoke at a Grand Rounds and then to some residents in South Carolina. And after the Grand Rounds, I was pinned in by attendings who wanted to talk about who they had lost. How they had felt, how their mentor had just committed suicide the month before. And when these things are happening, the story has to be told.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's an interesting thing you point out, right? Because it really does remind me, and I know that you and I have talked about this, offline and online before, about the shame that's associated with this. It's an interesting thing to discuss, because, I really love Brene Brown's work, as a shame researcher, and like the big distinction she draws between guilt and shame, right? Guilt being I did something bad, and shame being I am bad. It's an internal state of affairs. And when you have the guilt that is associated with, what happened and the impact it had on your family and your friends and, your close community, that guilt is what is in a very powerful way moves you to give these lectures and to provide something that's so needed, destigmatizing mental health in healthcare. Like that very positive and powerful impact comes out of that guilt. Whereas if you just self-harbored that shame, that's that thing telling you not to speak and that you should be ashamed of yourself and that, you're the weakest link. And how powerful is it that you're able to turn that experience into something that's helping so many people, right? But if you lived in shame, like shame, as coaching people, shame is an indulgent emotion from which nothing productive ever comes. So it's not shame that's motivating you to give those talks. So is it guilt, or is it what do you think is that emotion that you're tapping into in that space?
I think it's more shame, if I'm being honest. Like there's a little bit of guilt with my family and stuff like that, but to stand in front of physicians who you think are stronger than you,
Yeah.
you think haven't gone through these things, and to expose yourself as that person, right? I am quote unquote that guy. And
Yeah.
I've been coached on this, and I understand, like, it's just a thought. I get it, but it is still hard to stand up there and say, hey, I'm the guy that committed suicide.
100%. Well, I guess my question is that I bet the emotion that accompanies that is shame, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I bet that the feeling that motivates you to stand there anyway is certainly not shame. I don't know
No,
what that
it's
is for
not.
you.
No, it is. So reading the comments, like you said, 25,000 in one place. I think at one point between all sources, I had seen it shared over 100,000 times
I believe it.
with, an average, when it was going through Facebook, an average of at least 4 likes. And this was within the first 3 to 4 weeks. I realized that this needed to be said.
Yeah.
And that somebody else has a chance to not be me if I tell my story. Because a wise man learns from watching another man burn his head on the stove instead of touching it himself.
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah. And that is the motivation. That is the motivation. When I got a call out of the blue by an obstetric, the ACOG, they want to, I'm like, you guys are OB-GYN, you want me to talk? I'm ER, right? They're like, yeah, well, we want you to share your story.
Yeah.
And I was like, done.
Yeah. So
Done.
I'm kind of curious, just like to weave this all together, because I think this is such a messy, and like our human existence, right? We're all humans, we're all broken, but we're all infinitely lovable and worthy and enough all at the same time. Like humanity is just a mess. And I think this conversation and the themes that come out of it are messy too. Things like moral injury and burnout and, mental health, and where those things connect and where they collide. And, they surely seem related in some way, but they're not the same thing. They're also distinct entities. And so after your experience, like what is your view on, moral injury versus burnout versus mental health struggles, and how are those things connected for you?
They all kind of meet in the middle, right? If you're gonna draw a Venn diagram. So when you think about the first case review, and it being, even though I showed them literature, I did everything right, but this is a negative review for you from the group, by the way, not the hospital. The hospital, as a satisfaction-driven community, which is another problem in medicine all entirely, is the one that's forcing them to do these things, and they, to cover their tails, frequently write poor reviews on their people just to show that they're doing something about satisfaction or whatever. And to do something like that is definitely falls under moral injury, right? Because moral injury is seeing or witnessing or taking part or not taking part in things that you should or shouldn't do. And it relates to the military. But then when you're doing something right, but then being ostracized for it, essentially, that's definitely moral injury, right? And that fits in that group. The moral injury of, the case, the January 4th case, the moral injury of being told I'm being fired for being a good doc.
Yeah.
Doesn't make me feel like a good doc. But then I kind of work myself, and this ties into anybody that's got their golden handcuffs on, going out and buying all the things as soon as they come out of residency and then working extra shifts to cover it. What a nightmare that is. I'd kind of done that to myself to work my way out of a contract.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
so that's
at the beginning.
Yeah, that's burnout, right? I did that to myself. And then, I look back and figure out mental health. I think the burnout / the moral injury for me is this is where it comes to get together with mental health. That was stacking pressures and stressors on me that if I'd had coaching on each of those individual events, I really wouldn't have had like that stack of emotions / mental health outcomes, right? And then where they meet in the middle is where moral injury causes you to feel less about yourself and makes you feel depressed. Where burnout takes the love out of medicine.
It takes your motivation.
Yeah. And then the mental health just kind of is where it's kind of meeting in the middle, and they all play a part.
Yeah.
And they stack, it's cumulative, it stacks.
Yeah. And I think that, yeah, it's such a fun topic to talk about, honestly, like from an academic standpoint, but it's such a terrible thing in reality. And so, yeah, I agree with, a lot of what you're putting down in terms of, moral injury kind of being the systematic phenomenon that happens, right, to physicians, not because of physicians, it happens to them. Burnout's the individual phenomenon that happens. And I'll say that moral injury is often the cause of burnout, right?
For sure.
But you can certainly make burnout worse on your own too.
Yeah.
I think it's important to have a distinction between those two things, but I do think that both phenomenon exist. And Freudenberger, who originally described burnout, one of the quotes that I've read from him about this is how burnout is the extinction of motivation. And so, that is one of the results of a burned out individual. And so when you say like your love was gone and your intrinsic internal motivation was just no longer there, right? It kind of reminds me of that quote. And so I am interested, and maybe this will be the last question we talk about, boys, just because you've shared so much. But you mentioned coaching, and I don't take that lightly, because this isn't a conversation of a very serious topic that you're bringing. But you mentioned coaching kind of in a preventative way, that if you had coaching on your perspective on those individual events, the case reviews, and that individual event with, the patient that died, that this, in your mind at least, would not have happened. Can you tell me more about that? Like, why do you think that's the case?
So how we've talked about this before, and you covering a podcast, and I'll have some podcasts coming out in short order about the same thing. The circumstance is that I had a bad case review, right? In fact, I could just, I guess you can make it cleaner. I had a negative case review. And then my thoughts about it at the time were, I'm going to get fired. My thoughts about it at the time were, I did everything right. How can they do this to me? And of course, those are evoking other feelings, right? And then those feelings that's where we're starting to accumulate and cross now into the burnout and mental health portion of this. I think, coaching is not, it doesn't take the place of therapy. It doesn't take the place of medicine. What it does do is, it can help in those situations as well, as long as a cumulative effect. But what I really think is the coaching may have prevented me from going to that place in my mind. If I thought about, well, it doesn't really matter the negative review. I know I did the right thing. How does that make me feel? Justified, right? And then being justified, how am I going to act? I'm going to practice good medicine, right? But instead, I told you, I felt like I was walking on eggshells.
Yeah.
And like the next foot to fall was going to be the one that booted me out the door. And I think handling my thought processes along the way and never letting them stack up like that, there's no way to say for sure, but I would say would have stopped me.
Yeah. Well, I think it's an interesting idea that you're talking about, these stacking, not only these circumstances, but stacking the narratives, that perspective, that paradigm that you were telling yourselves about each of them, and those narratives stacking up and eventually leading to that mind space that you were in. And if you had taken, because you can't change those circumstances, you can't change that you're getting reviewed or rated, you can't change that the 19-year-old died. What you can change is that narrative, that perspective about them, and what they mean to you internally. And the cumulative result of that may have been that they didn't stack up quite so high, or maybe that they, you turn that obstacle into an opportunity, like you did with so much of the rest of your story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, boys, I really appreciate you again sharing this story. I think it's just such a powerful way to destigmatize mental health. And this is a topic that I know that I'm never going to shy away from. And I hope that you don't either. Suicide has personally touched my life, and I'm sure of many of the lives of people that are listening right now. And through your story, I think other people can feel a little more encouraged and a little more brave, courageousness, that they can share their own story too. So I appreciate you doing that. And as we round out this show, is there anything else that you'd leave a piece of mind, a comment, a one-line zinger, a thought that you might have, a piece of parting advice for the listeners of the podcast?
Yeah. Remember why you first got into medicine, right? Find your way back to that ideal, or if needed, find your way out into something that is equally as rewarding.
Yeah. Yep.
That's it.
Find your purpose, man.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. Well, Boyce, thank you so much for being on the show. I appreciate you sharing, and can't wait to have you back at some point in the future, man. We'll talk about diving into all these other topics.
Yeah, sure enough.
All right, Boyce.
Thanks
You
for
take
having me,
care.
Jimmy.
Absolutely.